So this section is a pretty long section of our book. It's 20.4, which introduces the concepts of blood pressure, resistance, and total blood flow. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start moving through this. We're going to define the term blood pressure first, which is the force of blood against the vessel wall. And so if you've got your vessel wall and you have blood pushing outward on it, this is going to increase your blood pressure, right? The more blood that you have in here, the more it's going to push against, and the more blood pressure you'll have. We notice that we have a change in our blood pressure as our blood is flowing further away from the heart. So I want to go ahead and illustrate this for you. So if right here you've got your heart, and as our blood is leaving, it's going to come back to our heart. And so this is going to be the same heart in both images. It's going to leave an artery, it's going to come to a capillary, which is narrow, and then it's going to return in a vein. So right here, as our heart, as our arteries narrow, the further they get from our heart, it is going to constrict blood flow. So imagine a tube running like so. If you took that tube and you blocked it and made a narrower tube leave it, you are going to end up increasing the amount of backup of blood right here. So there will be blood backing up in this section that cannot fit through here. So this is going, right here, the pressure is going to be lower, but right here, the pressure is going to be higher because there is more blood applying force to the outside of this vessel wall. And so over here, there is less blood applying force to the outside of this vessel. And so the further we get away from the heart, the less pressure we're going to feel. And also the further we get down a tube of even the same length, the less pressure we will feel. And this is because of the resistance of the blood flow as it continues to move through here. So it ends up meaning that the further we get back to our heart, so right here in our vena cava, we end up having a blood pressure of roughly 0. And so whereas over here we'll have a systolic blood pressure of roughly 120. So we have a very big drop in blood pressure. And this drop in blood pressure, if you'll remember, things go from high pressure to low pressure. So this is going to help create that pressure gradient to have continuous blood flow to or through our body. So arterial blood pressure is what we use to measure it. It's the blood pressure in our arteries, and this is pulsatile, which means it goes up and down. And this occurs because our ventricles are either contracting or relaxing. Whenever our ventricles are contracting, we're going to call this systolic pressure, which is our highest pressure. And if our ventricles are relaxing, we're going to call this our diastolic pressure, which is whenever our arteries are receiving their lowest amount of pressure and they are recoiling. So you can think about it as our arteries are stretched and then recoil, stretch and recoil. So the greater the stretch and then recoil, the more flexible or pliable our arteries are. So the correct ratio, or the proper normal ratio, is about 120/80. So pulse pressure is the pressure that the extra pressure that our vessels feel whenever it is the ventricles are contracting. And this is a very easy a thing to measure. It is your systolic pressure minus your diastolic. And so if it was 120/80, you would do 120 minus 80 equals our pulse pressure, and that's 40. So this measures the elasticity and recoil of our arteries. As before I said, if you stretch it at your systole, then it rebounds at our diastole. This shows how elastic our arteries are. If there's very little stretch, if these numbers are the same, then that means our arteries are not able to stretch and then recoil as well. And so we would have very low elasticity of our vessels. With age, we lose elasticity, so these are no longer able to stretch as hard or as easily, and so whenever they don't stretch as easily, our heart has to push harder to get blood through those vessels. And so this can sometimes increase in changes of our blood pressure, increase in in the amount of times our heart has to pump to maintain the pressure through this system. So the pulse that you feel, it's like you can feel it in your up here. It's the throbbing of our arteries whenever you pin it against something. And this allows you to determine your heartbeat because the pulse coincides with contractions of our heart. The more forceful the pulse, the higher the pressure. The more weak the pulse, the lower the pressure. So here are several pulse points that can determine or be used to determine pulse. And so y'all can look through these. A lot of them are pretty basic, and you're familiar with a lot of those. So here's our mean arterial pressure, which is the average of the pressure that our arteries experience. And so if you'll remember, our heart isn't contracted an even amount as it's relaxed. So we end up having to adjust this equation. So our mean arterial pressure is equal to our diastolic pressure and are added to 1/3 of our pulse pressure. And so if you were to write this all the way out, it would be diastolic plus 1/3 of our systolic minus diastolic. If you'll do this equation, you'll end up getting, with a normal blood pressure, 80 plus 1/3 of our pulse pressure, which we found to be 40, which is roughly 80 plus 13, which equals 93. And so this is the average mean arterial pressure for a person. The closer you are to the heart, the more it's going to experience the high pressures, and the further away from your heart, the less frequently it's going to experience pressures. And so the pressure is going to change as it moves through our vessels. So if we have a very high mean arterial pressure, greater than 160, which is enormous, if you'll see the slide before, it was 93 for an average human, in our brain we don't have lymph vessels to carry off this extra tissue, and so this can result in accumulation of fluids in our brain, which is termed cerebral edema, which is very dangerous. So whenever the blood reaches our capillaries, we will experience no pulse pressure, which means that we do not see a systolic and diastolic in our capillaries. We just have blood flowing through here. It's high enough to enforce or have hydrostatic pressure, but low enough to prevent damage from or to our vessels. So you're not going to force blood through very delicate vessels very rapidly. You're going to allow it to go through just enough to have exchange. And so we'll see at our arterial end it's about 40, and our venous end it's about 20, which results in the difference in our hydrostatic pressure at our arteriolar end versus hydrostatic pressure at our venous end, which allows us to bring blood back into our bloodstream and deliver it the rest of the way. Our venous blood pressure is involved in our venous return. This is getting movement of or results in the movement of our blood from our capillaries back up to our heart. Just like our capillaries, we don't have pulsatile pressure here. We won't feel any pulse in our veins. Down around our venules, which was at the end of the capillary beds, we'll experience about 20, but up close to the heart at the vena cava, we experience a blood pressure of about 0. And so this allows us to kind of have some play there. We can control this. So that means the pressure in our right atrium is very low. We can get venous return 2 different ways, or increase venous return 2 different ways. One of those is by this skeletal muscle pump. And so we remember that we have these valves in our veins. And so whenever the skeletal muscle contracts and it pushes in here on our vein, it is going to push outward on all directions. We increase the pressure in this one area. So remember, if we increase pressure here because it's being contracted, it's going to go from high pressure to low pressure. Well, right here it's sealed, so the only place for it to go is up here, which is closer to our heart. And so this is dominant in our limbs, and it helps move our blood out of our limbs and back to our heart. Another way we can do this is by respiratory movements. So if you can imagine now that you're your cavity or your body cavity, which is your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity, is like one giant egg with a membrane across the middle of it. And if you can take and shift that membrane one direction or the other, it changes the volume in the two different cavities. So whenever you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts and stretches out your thoracic cavity. This compresses your abdominal cavity, which pushes the blood up into the lower pressure area of our thoracic cavity. So whenever our diaphragm relaxes, it returns back to its normal position, which releases the compression in our abdomen, which makes it lower pressure here and higher pressure up here, which pushes that blood back into the heart now to keep it pumping.